Welcome to Gaslit Nation. I'm Sarah Kenzier. I'm a journalist and a scholar of authoritarian states with a focus on the former Soviet Union.
I'm Andrea, a writer, filmmaker who's been covering Ukraine and Russian aggression there for several years now. This is Car Talk, but instead of cars, we talk about authoritarianism.
We're a new podcast we launched a couple months ago, and we've been covering the corruption and atrocities of the Trump regime, and particularly the Mueller probe and the investigation into Trump and Kremlin interference. Our first 3 episodes are available online. They covered the year 2016, the year that inspired the title of our show, because Andrea and I spent that year being gaslit, along with millions of Americans who realized what was at stake. Trump is a Russian asset. Trump is a white supremacist. Trump, if elected, was going to instill a kleptocratic dynastic power. And as we called out for these things to stop, unfortunately, we were labeled hysterical, we were labeled alarmist. Trump is in, and what we said has come to pass. However, it's not too late. We're interested in breaking down what happened, because you can't make change without understanding what the problem is, and also looking for new solutions. And so today, on our first Gaslit Nation episode, where we have an interview, we're going to be talking to Barbara Simons. She's a computer scientist who focuses on election integrity. And she's also somebody who has been crying out for a very long time that our voting system is not secure, that, machines are hackable, that things need to be changed. And so we're really excited to share what she has to say with everybody, especially before the midterms. Before that, however, we're going to do a review of the news from the last few weeks. And our first item is on Ukraine. Now, Andrea is an expert on Ukraine, and she's going to break down what's happening there. But I just want to preface this by saying, Ukraine, throughout the Trump's various machinations, has proven to be a kind of testing ground for the tactics that they want to use and are using on the U.S. You see this in everything from election interference, of course, has a direct correlation with people like Manafort, who did that prior to taking charge of the Trump campaign. You see that with cyber attacks, where they hacked the Ukrainian grid. And you see this with attacks on political dissidents, suppression of freedom of speech, and other issues. And so I'm going to turn over the news now to Andrea, who's going to bring you the story of a dissident under threat.
Yeah, this is going to be a hard one for me to talk about. I've been following this story for some years now, and his story has been weighing heavily on me, especially lately. So we're focusing now on Crimea, Russia's invasion of Crimea in February 2014. Oleg Sentsov, he is a Ukrainian filmmaker whose career was on the rise. He was volunteering his time as an office manager, helping protesters, activists in Crimea keep things organized, keep things running. Like any good director, that's what they like to do. So I'm going to read from a August 2015 article that I wrote for the Daily Beast about Oleg Sentsov and what happened to him in Crimea. Few filmmakers achieved the meteoric success of Oleg Sentsov. After self-funding his first feature, Gamer, he received wide acclaim at the film's premiere at the Rotterdam International Film Festival in 2012. The story is a raw, realistic portrayal of the isolation and glory dreams of a young video gamer stuck in a small Ukrainian town. The sensitivity to his amateur actors, real gamers that Sentsov met in his years running a gaming club for kids in Crimea, earned Sentsov praise as a director. It also landed him funding for his next project, a gangster drama called Rhino. This was a director to watch. But last year, this was 2014, Sentsov put his artistic ambitions on hold and joined the revolution sweeping his country, activism that made him a target of the Russian secret police. In May 2014, shortly after Russia's annexation of Crimea, he was kidnapped from his home and tortured and interrogated. So Oleg Sentsov has been in prison ever since. He was moved to one of the worst prisons inside Russia. And on May 14th, he announced that he was going on a hunger strike. And he's been on a hunger strike ever since. And he's around day 100. And his health is rapidly deteriorating. And his family, his friends feel completely helpless watching this. Anybody who cares about human rights feels completely helpless watching this. And of course, what's going to happen is Putin's going to let him die in prison. I mean, that's really what we're watching here, is a innocent person following this long tradition of Kremlin oppression, wasting away inside prison. Stalin did this during the purges, of course, and under Putin, Stalin has been resurrected as a great hero, and Putin is going to just stick to his guns and allow Oleg Sentsov to die. It's a warning to anybody who tries to get in his way, tries to protest him, whether it's something like a social media post or taking the street. It's very painful watching this happen. So that's why I said to Sarah, I'm like, we're starting the news roundup with Oleg Sentsov. This is essentially the start of a funeral for him and a memorial to the countless victims
it is hard,
inside
and
Russia.
I'm glad that you started with it. I guess something people should know about both of us is that we both have a lot of experience, working with political dissidents who were targeted by authoritarian states. I used to be an expert witness in court for asylum seekers from Uzbekistan who were targeted by that government. And I think there's this tendency in the U.S. to kind of romanticize the life of a dissident, to sort of see it as this noble quest, with suffering, but with some kind of inevitable win or some sort of honor that's innately bestowed. And the reality is very grim. The reality is heartbreaking. You're risking your life. You're risking your family's safety. You're putting yourself out there for a dream and for justice that may never be seen. And so, I want people to know that. I'm not saying that to discourage people in the US or in Ukraine or anywhere else from participating, in principled actions against corrupt governments. I absolutely think they should. But I think I'm really glad that you brought this up, because people need to realize the human side of this, the risk of this, and that the good guys don't always win. But it is worth it. It's worth it always to put up a fight. I don't know what else we're living for.
That's exactly what Oleg Sentsov has said. He's not on a hunger strike for himself. He's on a hunger strike for the dozens of political prisoners being held inside Russia. One human rights group estimated that there are 88 people being held in Russia for activities related to protesting the war in Ukraine. Just to underline what Sarah just said, Oleg Sentsov himself is fighting for this higher ideal, what it means to be human. This is his quote. He said, If we are supposed to become nails in the coffins of a tyrant, I'd like to be one of those nails. Just know that this particular one won't bend. It's episode 4 and I'm already crying. I made it to the...
It's okay. But people need to know that this is happening, and people need to, I don't know, sometimes there's this tendency to view the conflict in Ukraine or anywhere abroad as this kind of abstract international relations issues where there are winners and losers. I think that people, they miss the human side of it. I think I wrote in my book, like, when you have to be humanized, it means you're already losing. But we see that. And so I hope people grasp this. I hope people understand the nature of this kind of sacrifice, and that often this is the kind of thing that it takes to win. And we have a tradition of that in the United States as well. This is a universal problem, I think, of corruption, of oppression, and of the bravery of some who are willing to stand up to it, no matter what the consequences are for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when we talk about repression in authoritarian states, what a massive casualty of these dictators is the human potential of these countries, of these people. Imagine how the Russian people would be contributing, given the massive amount of creativity there, if they didn't have a dictator like Putin holding them down. It's just the human potential that's being robbed from us. Like, imagine all the solutions they'd be contributing with in terms of technological advancements, in terms of confronting all the massive crises, from environmental incoming catastrophe to cleaning up the space junk, what have you. We need the Russian mind to be free, and right now it's not. When you talk about the casualties of authoritarian regimes, it's Oleg Sentsov is not only a casualty because of what he's undergoing now, the slow death that he's undergoing now. It's also, we're deprived of his creativity, of his films. He turned one of my favorite short stories, Salinger's A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. He turned that into a short film. This was somebody that was on his way to collaborating with major European filmmakers because they spotted his talent. And, I know you may think, films are frivolous or for entertainment, but having a filmmaker like Oleg Sentsov from Ukraine making it, what he's essentially doing is bringing in greater opportunity for Ukraine, a country that's been devastated from years of corruption and years of decay under Soviet occupation. And that you absolutely need that type of energy, that type of economic opportunity flooding into the country. And it would have done so through a rising star like Oleg Sentsov. films, even the bad ones, films create jobs, films create opportunity and growth for people. So a lot of this is also we're being deprived, in Ukraine is being deprived from that human potential. So I think we need to move on from but yeah, so please, if you could, pay attention to what's going on to Oleg Sentsov. If you could share the hashtag #FreeSentsov. If you go to Day Magazine when the 4th episode of Gaslit Nation publishes, we'll have some extra steps you can take there to help Oleg Sentsov and other political prisoners inside Russia. Crimea, we forget what it means. It's the first time that borders have changed by force since World War II. The list of human rights abuses is very long there, including like a clamping down of the press. Because our president is a Russian asset, Trump says he can override Congress on recognizing Russian sovereignty over Crimea.
I remember in 2014 that it was greeted with intense shock. People could not believe that Russia was doing this, and it was referred to as an invasion. And there was concern for a humanitarian crisis, concern about violation of international law. And over time, the tenor of the coverage changed so that it was normalized, due in part to the passage of time. But because of the actions of people like Manafort, who were over in Ukraine, who were hired purposely to install a certain propaganda narrative in Western media. And in some of the court documents released recently, they talk about that. They discuss how he sought to plant certain narratives about Ukraine and Crimea in the Western press, and kind of, I guess you could say the complicity of the Western media. I feel like this is something that should be labeled. It's not like media outlets committed an illegal action in running these op-eds, but you should say this was brought to us by a lobbyist who is advocating for the interests of a certain individual. Like, I feel like there should be transparency in that. I think the lack of transparency in lobbying and media has been a serious problem, but it's something, to listen to you bring this up, how norm shattering this was, and how people have kind of just shrugged and said, yeah, that's the way it is. Crimea is part of Russia. It's just another example of how easily norms can change, how easily the unthinkable can happen, which is, of course, something you should keep in mind when you're living in a United States that's overseen by Donald Trump.
Yeah, no, nothing about what the invasion, occupation of Crimea is normal. It's a melting pot of different ethnicities, and of course you had the Crimean Tatars who've been there before anybody. There is no natural claim to Crimea by anyone, and it was politically for many decades under Ukraine. Ukraine built up the infrastructure, invested all this money on making Crimea what it is today, and Russia just snatched it. And of course, when you have an aggressive, determined regime like the Kremlin, they're not going to stop there. They're eventually going to come to you, and they eventually came in the U.S. We no longer have the moats of our oceans to protect us, and they're able to hack our election and really tip the scales for Donald Trump, an illegitimate president. Yeah, and it's hurting the Russian people themselves, obviously, because they're getting sanctioned, because you have to sanction Putin. If you don't, he will keep going. The sanctions are working. The sanctions are containing him, I believe, because it could be a lot worse than what it already is. So the journalist Simon Ostrovsky sums this up perfectly. Simon tweeted, "When I lived in Russia, the ruble hovered around 30 to the dollar for years and years. It still blows my mind that it has lost more than half its value since the annexation of Crimea. Imagine trading half your people's savings for a small piece of another country." The U.S. just passed further sanctions against Russia. This is from CBS. The Trump administration will impose new sanctions on Russia, alleging that President Putin and the Russian government used a chemical weapon to poison former Russian spy Sergei Skripal in an assassination attempt in Great Britain. Sanctions will go into effect on August 22nd. The State Department officials told reporters on a call that the economic impact of the sanctions would be in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars.
We've already seen some of the oligarchs who would be affected by them find other means of getting by, like Roman Abramovich has now become an Israeli citizen so that he can be, somewhat removed from the effects of the sanctions. I feel like this is yet another situation where ordinary people may be hurt, but these gangs of oligarchs and plutocrats may still skate by.
But at the same time, it's just the passage of them. Sanctions do matter, or else Putin wouldn't have gone to all this trouble to invade our election.
Absolutely.
The name of the game of that whole Trump Tower meeting was about getting sanctions dropped. And so Putin, as a deal maker, he's impatient and he wants everything. He really pushes negotiations to the far limit. And so this is getting under his skin. Even if, let's say, these sanctions take a very long time to kick in, just the simple fact that they're being passed, it's like an embarrassment for him. It's like Putin should have a T-shirt that says, I stole the election for Donald Trump and all I got was this lousy T-shirt and more sanctions. His oligarchs around him must be like, what is happening? Why are they doing this to us after all that we've done for them? And that's also been the tone on Russian state TV. Well, so Russia's now hacking space. They're not content just with democracies. They're now going after the satellites in space. A U.S. State Department official announced that the U.S. has serious concerns that Russia is developing anti-satellite weapons. Presumably, they're going to use these weapons, holding them like a gun to our heads if America's deep state doesn't stop its witch hunt against its asset, the White House. I don't know why. Why else would they be picking up all this activity threatening our satellites now?
Exactly. And so, there's a lot of jokes being made about Space Force. And, I think like any kind of Trump-sponsored initiative, Space Force is likely a money laundering venture in certain ways. I certainly don't think it's going to be designed and run appropriately. But at the same time, there is a genuine national security threat here in terms of what Russia or any country could do to satellites. I tend to be somewhat suspicious of whether Russia would attack. Well, it's like Russia would not attack Trump. Russia would attack the U.S. Trump would also attack the U.S. That's something that people need to get through their heads, is that Trump and a few others in the administration, but in particular him, does not care what happens to U.S. citizens. He doesn't care, for example, what happens to veterans. He doesn't care if people are deprived of resources. He only cares about his money, his family, holding onto power and not going to jail. So if there is some kind of humanitarian crisis caused by a cyber attack or caused by, something involving satellites, he's only going to care to the extent that it affects him. Maybe he won't be able to get on Twitter and harass people as easily.
I think if Trump were to run away to Russia, just like Yanukovych, Manafort's previous client before him, I think he would be like, use the nuclear weapons, Vlad, bomb New York.
Oh yeah.
CNN. If he got his hands on like another country's nuclear weapons, I think he would actually like pull the trigger and have a field day.
He doesn't have any baseline loyalty to the US, and he doesn't have any basic human empathy. The most likely scenario, unfortunately for now, is that he stays in power. I think if he's removed from the White House, it's more likely to be kicking and screaming and handcuffed out, although, the likelihood of that seems to be going down. But I could easily see that, he doesn't care, to put it mildly, what happens to average people in the U.S.
For most of our lives, Sarah, all we've witnessed is institutional failure. From George W. Bush stealing the election in 2000 in Florida, from George W. Bush likely stealing the election in 2004 with what went on in Ohio. And then, of course, the trumped-up invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, which the media establishment seemed to get lockstep in to support. And
the financial crisis with no one punished.
Yes, which is allowed to get bailed out, and they're just back at it again. And so we could be on the verge of another crash. That's why you and I, at least privately, I don't know what you put out there, but I think we're holding our breath on whether the Mueller investigation will actually lead to anything, because we haven't seen that pattern. We've seen the opposite pattern, where people have gotten away stealing the savings of millions. When it comes to Mueller and whether that's going to bear fruit, whether Manafort is going to have a guilty plea or not, whether Manafort is going to end up in prison for the rest of his life as he should or not. I mean, it's depressing that you and I, at least privately, are like, we don't know what this could lead to, if anything, given the track record of the decline of American institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's frustrating because there are all these people who want us to put faith in our institutions, but faith has to be earned. And there's no reason for us to have faith in any of this happening, especially when, the most corrupt elements are now holding the reins. They're in a position where they can stack courts, they can fire investigators, they can try to rewrite laws, and they don't have shame. Norms have been shattered. Law is the only thing that remains, and that law gets chipped at every single day. And to kind of go back to what we talked about in the previous episode, I'm still wondering why, when all of this was happening in front of our faces, and when you had people like Mueller giving speeches like he did in 2011 about this new criminal nexus between organized crime, governments, corporations, elections and basically predicting everything that was to come for the next 7 years, why people weren't able to put a stop to it. And that can be, there's a number of reasons. There's opportunism, there's incompetence, there's bureaucracy. But, to kind of go back to what we were just talking about with the hacking, I've wondered, especially since about 2014 and stuff, when the hacking the cyber attacks on the US really increased, whether the real compromise is not some sort of personal blackmail that, Russia or other actors are holding over the country and individuals in the country, but whether it's a systemic attack, whether people are held back in their ability to solve criminal justice problems, to clamp down on corruption by a potential humanitarian crisis that could, be unleashed fairly easily if they are able to, for example, control our grid, control air traffic. I'm probably terrifying everybody, but...
And now our satellites.
Yeah, so we apologize. Don't listen to this before you sleep. And I don't mean to frighten people, but I do wish that all these things were taken more seriously and discussed in a more forthright way, because that's the only way that they can be resolved. We're citizens. We deserve answers. You deserve answers. And so I don't think there's anything wrong kind of floating that possibility when so much evidence seems to lead in that direction. And if it's, if I'm wrong, I will be absolutely thrilled to be wrong.
I will not answer that question.
A witness will answer the question.
Embattled FBI agent Peter Strzok faced off with House Republicans in his first public hearing, which descended into chaos after his first answer. Strzok expressed remorse for how the thousands of text messages he exchanged with former colleague Lisa Page have been used to question the integrity of the FBI investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Strzok sought to explain one of his most controversial texts when he assured Page that, quote, "will stop Trump."
It was in response to a series of events that included then-candidate Trump insulting the immigrant family of a fallen war hero. And my presumption, based on that horrible, disgusting behavior, that the American population would not elect somebody demonstrating that behavior to be president of the United States.
We have here in America a good old-fashioned purge going on. It has moments of acceleration, just like it did these last 2 weeks. FBI agent Peter Strzok was fired over his anti-Trump texts. You all remember Peter Strzok. He basically spoke for all of us in that congressional hearing. Trump revoked former CIA director and high-profile Trump critic John Brennan's security clearance. Reporter of the Washington Post tweeted that Trump is also reviewing security clearances of James Clapper, James Comey, Michael Hayden, Sally Yates, Susan Rice, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, and Lisa Page, all political critics of Trump. So we always knew he had an enemies list as a private citizen.
Oh, yeah. He's bragged about his enemies list. It wasn't secret like Nixon. He's talked about it. And I think in this case, it's annoying in some respects that people kept looking for parallels to Watergate. Because for one, this is much worse. This is not a domestic crisis. This is a matter of treason. This is a serious threat to national security. But also they keep kind of expecting a replication. They want to see that Saturday Night Massacre to kind of, prove that this is for real. And we've been seeing a slow motion Saturday Night Massacre with the firings of Comey, of McCabe. And this is a very typical part of authoritarian consolidation. When you get an autocrat in power, especially if they're brought through in a democratic system, this is how they chip away at accountability, at oversight, and at anybody who they feel can bring them down. They both seek to delegitimize them in the public sphere, but also remove any, legal power that they may have. And these are all people who are witnesses to the firing of Comey. They're witnesses to these politically motivated firings while being, victims of politically motivated firings themselves. And I expect this to continue. It's one of the reasons that I want Mueller to move faster, to, not to wrap things up. That's not what I'm saying at all, because this is a very enormous and extensive investigation. It's going to take a lot of time. But I think the worst actors, the most destructive people, need to be removed now, because they will rewrite the law. They will fire anyone who stands in their way. They will demonize intelligence agencies. They'll demonize anyone. I mean, we saw this with the attack attacks on the media recently. It's just going to get worse the longer that they stay in. It will become entrenched, and people will, in some respects, adapt to it, just as has happened in other countries that have taken this authoritarian turn in the last few years, like in Turkey and in Poland, in Hungary. And we can't let that happen here.
And so now we're going to turn our attention to, because she's demanding it, Omarosa. You all remember Omarosa. Let's play that famous clip of hers.
Our opponents, the media, and the whole world will soon see, as we begin to take further actions, that the powers of the president to protect our country are very substantial and will not be questioned.
Oh, wait, no, sorry. That was Stephen Miller, who's still in the White House. This is Omarosa.
Every critic, every detractor will have to bow down to President Trump.
No, I do have to say, I know we just talked about how for most of our lives, all you and I have known is institutional failure, but Omarosa coming out here and just blasting everybody. I mean, yes, she's pointing out the obvious, that Trump is racist, that he covets his daughter Ivanka, that Ivanka's so used to it and is essentially like her father. Like, there's a lot of juicy stuff that I'm really enjoying. So thank you, Omarosa, for that. But one surprising aspect of this whole story that is actually filling me with optimism is this. Omarosa is a professional social climber. A social climber like her can recognize that Jared and Ivanka, too, are going to cling on for dear life no matter what happens, because they, too, are professional social climbers. And the fact that Omarosa, who has seen Jared and Ivanka up close, sees what they're made of, and is just burning that Trump bridge down. First and foremost, the Trump clan with a K, the Trump clan values loyalty. Loyalty is the number one commodity for the Trumps. And another thing, Omarosa, to her credit, she could have made a lot more money writing a book called I Am Donald Trump's Black Friend. Everybody on the far right would buy it. So they could go home for Thanksgiving and tell their hipster relatives, I can't be racist. I bought Omarosa's book. So she could arguably make a lot more money that way. And the fact that she's trying to cross over and just airing it all out, if your ship is sinking to the point that even Omarosa is getting off, that actually makes you optimistic of what lies ahead.
I'm a lot more mixed on that. I mean, I think Omarosa is one of the smarter people that has come out of this White House. I think she has a very good understanding of media. She came from Trump's orbit. She understands him. My question is just sort of what is the goal here? Where does her loyalty lie? Because for the Trumps, I mean, yeah, it might bother Jared and Ivanka about, social climbing and whatnot, but, they have serious goals. They're trying to build a dynastic kleptocracy, and the obstacle to that isn't scandal, it's legal obstacles. And some of what Omarosa is doing reminds me a bit of the Michael Wolff book that came out earlier in the year, which everyone was like, oh my God, this is so terrible for Trump. And I was thinking, no, Michael Wolff's book is actually really good because for Trump, I mean, not as a book, because it portrays them as incompetent. It portrays Trump as kind of removed from daily activity in the White House. There's some of that in Omarosa's book as well. And when you're the target of a criminal probe, that's a much better representation than saying that you are aware, you are complicit. If Omarosa is going to continue to talk about this, I hope that she, one, goes to Mueller, but also brings forward stuff that has actual legal repercussions. Because I think at heart, as long as the Trump family and their cohorts have their money, have power, and are not prosecuted, they don't care if there's a scandal out there. I mean, they come from reality television. Initially, I thought a lot of this was just straight out manufactured. I'm a little more skeptical of that now because I think, Omarosa has her pride and her own ambitions, and they may well be clashing with those of the administration. I hope they do. So I guess we'll see in the weeks to come.
Yeah, and she told Katie Tur that she talked to Robert Mueller's office and there was a lot of corruption on the campaign, she told the FBI, and as well as the administration, there's a lot of corruption there, and that Trump knew about the hacked emails before they were released. So she's really going for the jugular, which I appreciate. And yes, it's Omarosa, but I would love to see that FBI interview.
Take what you can get. Thing I want to bring up just before we move on from this is just the issue of The Apprentice and of Mark Burnett himself, because I feel like this is not given enough coverage. Lots of people talk about the Trump tapes of Trump saying offensive things, which is like, what else is new? He's putting migrant children in cages. You're really going to be shocked that he said the N-word on tape. But they're not really talking about the broader context of Mark Burnett's career and his relationship with Trump, because before Burnett launched The Apprentice, which of course was the show show that portrayed Trump as this successful tycoon, which was an image that a lot of Americans who were unfamiliar with his earlier disasters and bankruptcies, they accepted that. It really helped them in the campaign. Before that, Burnett wanted to have a show about Putin. He wanted to have a show that would, bring Putin to an American audience in a flattering and positive light. And he proposed that all the way back, I think it was right after Survivor, all the way back in like 2000, 2001. That's a long relationship right there. And, something that's interesting about this is that around the time that Burnett was proposing this thing that would boost the show, that would boost Putin's image in the same way that Trump's image was boosted in the US. Michael Caputo, who was involved with the Trump campaign, who was one of the managers for it, was working as Putin's image consultant. So you have this kind of nexus of individuals who all went on to play a role in the 2016 campaign and with Kremlin interference and Trump involved in show business and in creating these kind of reality TV venues for Trump, and what they wanted to do, it was for Putin. And I wonder what the tie is there, and encourage people to investigate this, because this information has been in the public domain for a very long time. It's gonna be like my epitaph, is this is in the public domain.
It was in the public domain.
So yeah.
My favorite detail before we close off of Omarosa, I know, Omarosa, if you're listening, I welcome you to Gaslit Nation. I feel like that would be like a 5-hour show. I'd want to hear all of it. I want to hear all the tapes. I know she recorded everybody. So my favorite little detail was that Ivanka would not stop complaining about SNL's complicit perfume ad. Like her father, Ivanka was thin-skinned and could not seem to take a joke. As we've said on Gaslit Nation, Ivanka is just her father, but in a prettier package, which makes her more dangerous because Americans love blondes. When Sarah and I first started this podcast, we didn't know what to expect. And we're still very much like a garage band podcast, just trying to make this work. There's 3 of us, me, Sarah, and our producer Amy, who relentlessly work on the editing, who go through many different drafts before we publish every show. And we're thrilled by the support we're seeing online. So we want to continue growing, and we can do that with your help and the help of our sponsors. Yeah, big announcement. Gaslit Nation, 4th episode, we have sponsors. And we're proud to say it because the revenue it brings in helps grow women-owned and operated sites like Dame Magazine that we're proud to partner with, and Critical Frequency, also women-owned. All of this is getting important voices out into the air, so we're thrilled to have you sponsor. Bear with us. ZipRecruiter, our exciting, we're thrilled to have you sponsor. ZipRecruiter sends your job to over 100 of the web's leading job boards. ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes to find people with the right experience and invite them to apply for your job. So please, for the love of God, check out ZipRecruiter.com/gaslit. Yes, go to ZipRecruiter.com/gaslit. Just pull up that link, check it out. As applications come in, ZipRecruiter analyzes each one and spotlights the top candidates so you never miss a great match. Our listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at this exclusive web address, which I've given you 3 times now because I'm still learning all this. ZipRecruiter.com/gaslit. That's ZipRecruiter.com/GASLIT. All right? ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
I'm going to talk about our other sponsor, which is Sunbasket. Sunbasket delivers delicious meal kits right to your door, making healthy cooking easy and convenient for any busy lifestyle. They have organic produce, clean ingredients, 18 healthy options, including gluten-free, Mediterranean, vegan, all sorts of stuff. Now, and I have to say, this Sunbasket thing was pretty cool. You know what else is gaslit, Andrea?
What?
The stove where I cooked my sloppy Joe. So, boom, we'll be here all day. But no, it's actually good. Here's where you can get a discount, and everyone knows I love a discount. You can go to sunbasket.com/gaslit today to learn more and get $35 off your first order. That is sunbasket.com/gaslit for $35 off. Sunbasket.com/gaslit. So thank you, sponsors, because as Andrea said, we would not be able to keep the show going without you, without your support. Thank you very much.
All right, so Manafort, let's go to the ostrich ankle bracelet that is Paul Manafort. It's very difficult for us to cover the Trump age because news breaks very fast. So Sarah and I had to make the decision, like, do we record, do we wait for what the verdict is in the Paul Manafort trial? We're waiting on that still. So go to our Twitter accounts to see our reaction or whatever comes down the pipe from that. I can't believe it's taking this long for the jury to make a decision. I mean, if you put a black light on Paul Manafort, like, he's covered in political STDs, like little microscopic Roger Stones. Like, that's how dirty he is. So for a jury to take this long, I'm kind of like, oh, Jesus, like, what's going on?
Yeah, I feel the same way. And also, the jury wasn't sequestered. And I keep thinking, if you're Paul Manafort, you're tied to the mafia, you're tied to the Kremlin, you're tied to Donald Trump, to Roger Stone, you've spent your entire life doing shady shit. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to mess with the jury. You're going to mess with the judge. I mean, and nothing has stopped him. When Manafort was indicted, he got indicted again for witness tampering. And that was just a few months ago. And so I'm kind of surprised that knowing him, knowing what kind of shit he gets up to, that this jury could potentially be exposed to that. And I really hope that that's not the direction that this court case takes. I hope everything is working as it should, but it certainly concerns me because it seems like it would be pretty easy to rig it. And he seems pretty smug. He's sitting in the courtroom, winking at his wife, seemingly unconcerned. And so, yeah, I have a bad feeling about it. I mean, I guess the good part is that he's been charged with so many crimes that we may just get replays of this. But I think it'll be a symbolic win or loss. Regardless what happens, it'll set the tenor for events to come.
If Trump could pardon Joe Arpaio, who essentially ran a concentration camp in Arizona, Manafort looks smug because he's probably expecting a pardon. Like, as we always talk about, there's that mafia loyalty between them.
There's the pardons, but I worry about an acquittal. I worry about a hung jury. I mean, my God, by the time this episode airs,
that's what it's like to report in the Trump age. Everything just moves too fast.
We'll see. If we were right, we'll keep it.
We'll edit it. We'll be like, see, our prediction was correct. We told you it'd go like XYZ. Yeah.
There's so many loopholes. There's so many ways for them to get around it. I mean, and that plays into what we were saying before with our concerns about the Mueller probe. These are guys who've done sleazy, dirty tricks their entire lives. It is literally their job, and they're old now, and they're skilled at this. So I really don't think they went into this situation unprepared. They like to portray themselves as bumbling morons, and, maybe in like the fashion department, Manafort is, but I think they do know what they're doing, and they're hooked up with a lot of people who have a lot of financial and political interests at stake. And they're going to do everything they can to screw over the system and to manipulate it.
Yep. These people cannot look past themselves. It's all about their own profit at the expense of our sovereignty. Just in terms of where we are in the spreading cancer of authoritarianism in America, like, they're just out in the open now more than ever before. I mean, Trump is speaking openly about how Crimea belongs with Russia. They're not even trying to hide it. Like, the purge is accelerating. So we're at this stage of authoritarianism in America where they're exhausted and they don't have the energy to pretend anymore.
Yeah, well, maybe on that note, we should talk about our guest today.
Yes. So today we have the wonderful Barbara Simons. She is a computer scientist for the last decade or so, has been trying to warn all of us about the need to secure our elections. She is a leading figure on this topic. When in doubt on election hacking, check in with Barbara Simons. Whatever she's saying is gospel. I very rarely say that about anybody. I'm always saying you need to read widely, have diverse sources, but Barbara Simons is without a doubt somebody you can absolutely trust on this, because not only is she a leader on the topic, but she's also essentially a tenacious community organizer who's working across parties to secure our election systems.
Senator Harry Reid is asking the FBI to investigate the possibility that Russia may try to manipulate the presidential election. In a letter to the FBI's director, the Senate Minority Leader wrote the threat, and I quote, is more extensive than widely known and may include the intent to falsify official election results, end quote. 2 apparent cyber breaches in June targeted voting data in Arizona and in Illinois. The FBI has issued a warning telling election officials to increase security nationwide.
You know what everybody knew? Everybody knew that Russian hackers compromised the DNC databases. Everybody knew Russian hackers compromised Hillary Clinton's campaign emails because they leaked all of those. What was a lot less clear was how far did these attackers go in trying to compromise actual voter registration systems and campaign finance systems, which are critical, to functioning elections. So our story today reported that the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, flagged on at least 39 states where systems were compromised. And we consider electoral infrastructure, both voter registration databases, which are really key to elections going off without a hitch, and campaign finance databases. And within the government, this set off a lot of alarms within the White House, especially because in Illinois, which was the first state to kind of flag this for the government, there's forensic evidence showing that the attackers tried to alter or delete information such as names and addresses. And the point of that being, if you change that information, somebody goes to the polls, they're not in the poll book for that location, it's going to create chaos.
The Russians have interfered in a lot of other elections. The Russians have hacked into some of our most secret military information. The Russians have been active using it as a tool as part of Vladimir Putin's ambition to regain Russian prominence and dominance in some parts of the world.
Senator Nelson, can you elaborate on what you told my colleague Steve Bousquet yesterday about Russians being in Florida election records? Do you mean right now, or were you referring to 2016?
Right now.
What do you mean by they're in the election records? What do you mean by that?
Just exactly what I said. They have already penetrated certain counties in the state, and they now have free reign to move about.
But now, 3 people familiar with the intelligence tell NBC News' Ken Delaney that there is a classified basis for Nelson's assertion. They say Nelson was talking about intelligence related to ongoing fallout from the 2016 hack of a Florida elections vendor. Nelson declined to comment, but this all shows how secrecy, politics, and divisions between state and federal systems can get in the way of a unified response to the Russian threat.
A huge day at Gaslit Nation. Sarah Kendzior and I are here speaking with Barbara Simons, a big celebrity in our world. She is a computer scientist, a former researcher at IBM, the co-author of Broken Ballots, Will Your Vote Count, and a board member of the nonpartisan election integrity nonprofit Verified Voting. Barbara, we are a little starstruck right now to be speaking with you. And so we have a lot of questions. Obviously, election security is a critical issue. It is now a mainstream issue because of the surprise election of Donald Trump and Russia's blatant help in hacking the election. And so we have a lot of questions for you. So the first, of course, where are we? Could you just talk us through the landscape of election security across America right now?
Well, it's a lot worse than it should be. We still have 5 states that are where the people vote on totally paperless machines. In other words, there's no way to do a recount. Georgia is one of the states, by the way, and of course there's a big election coming up there in November. And unless something is done to eliminate the paperless machines there will be no way again to do a recount of that election. There are also another 8 states that are partially paperless. For example, Pennsylvania is 83% paperless, and that's another critical state. And on top of that, even where there are paper ballots, there can be issues. One of the things that we saw in the 2016 recount effort is that some recount laws appear to be written to prevent recounts. That certainly seemed to be the case in Pennsylvania, although, of course, a full recount there would have been impossible because of all the paperless machines. But there are other states, too, that have issues with that. And just to add one other point, since you haven't interrupted me yet, these paper ballots tend to be counted on scanners. And what I think most people don't realize is that these scanners themselves are basically computers. I think a lot of people think of them as, well, they're just counting machines. But they are, in fact, computers because they have to be programmed the scanners have to be programmed to say who the candidates are and where their locations are on the ballot and so on. So these are computers, and because they are computers, they also are vulnerable. So we have a huge task ahead of us to make our elections secure. We know how to do it. We know it needs to be done, but it's going to take a lot of effort.
So why aren't we doing it? Why can't we 100% secure our election systems?
Well, I think there's several reasons. I think the number one reason is money. Even in places that want to replace insecure voting technology with more secure voter marked paper ballot systems, this requires money, and some places just don't have it. So one of the things that we have been working on is trying to get federal legislation passed that will provide the adequate funding to at least get recountable voting systems throughout the country. That's one reason. I think another reason is that some people just don't believe that there are problems with the voting systems. And election officials, I think almost all election officials want to run honest, fair elections, and they're very proud of the work they do. But they sometimes may not. They may be uncomfortable with having people question where their technology works. Which I can understand that, and that's human nature. But there can be some resistance there. And then I think, at least in the case of some politicians or policymakers, I should say, the fact that you were elected using a particular voting system, you don't want to question if that voting system worked correctly, because of course you won, and you would like to believe that you won honestly and legitimately. And so there has at least historically been a bit of resistance to asking questions about that.
During the 2016 election, the Obama White House offered help to states to address these concerns, and not all the states took the administration up on this. Is there a way for us to, I know the history of states' rights versus the federal government is obviously a very loaded issue in America's history, but is there a way for us to sort of go in there and say, this is for the good of all of us? I'm sorry if we're hurting your pride, but is there any way for us to go in for the good of the country? And any leverage that we have to sort of just go in and implement these measures?
I think the carrot is better than the stick in this case. I do think that providing the funding is a big incentive. There will be a lot of pushback to any effort to force states to do things a certain way. There have been a few cases where the federal legislation has been passed that requires certain steps for voting, like the Voting Rights Act, which is a very famous example, but also the Help America Vote Act, which was passed in 2002 and provided almost $4 billion to buy new voting machines, and which resulted in a lot of these really insecure voting machines being purchased. But even that was voluntary. That was not required. Well, I take that back. There were requirements to get rid of certain types of voting technologies in that legislation. So there were some requirements. But I think certainly in the current climate, as you say, there is a lot of awareness, and providing, and the machines are getting old. So even people who were reasonably happy with the voting machines that they have recognize that they're getting old, and they're having problems with them. Software is very old, and there are even physical problems with machines breaking down. So I don't think we need to be really aggressive. I think the main thing is getting the money. However, there is another aspect to it, which is we want to make sure that this money is used wisely, and that follow-up steps are taken to check on the scanners. So I think, again, there are ways that this can be done where at least one of the aspects of the legislation that we're working on is to provide a panel of experts who would come up with recommendations, and then those recommendations would be used to encourage states to invest the money wisely. I can go in a little bit to what we need to do to make our elections truly secure. Paper ballots are necessary, but they're not sufficient.
Okay, so if you had a magic wand and all the money in the world, what would it look like to you? What are the steps we need to implement right now to have 100% peace of mind?
I'm focusing on voting machines right now. So what we need to do is, first of all, we need to have voting systems that produce where there are voter-marked paper ballots. Voter marked is really critical. Typically, that would be like what we have in California, where you have a paper ballot and you take a pen and you, in the case of California, there are broken arrows between the, next to the candidate names and the candidate you want. You just connect two sides of the arrow, or you might fill in an oval like we used to do with the SAT tests. Those are where this is done manually by the voter. Voters with disabilities may not be able to do this, and so for them, there are devices called ballot marking devices, which look like some of these really bad machines, but in fact, they look like these old touchscreen machines. But in fact, what they do is they produce a paper ballot, which where the selections have been made by the voter. So that's what I mean by voter marked paper ballots. And perhaps the critical distinction is that these ballots should not be counted in the same machine that creates them. So these ballot marking devices do not count the ballots. The ballots are then put into a separate machine, which is a scanner. We basically need these standalone paper ballots, and we need to check on the scanners. The machine, if the machines that mark the ballots also count the ballots, then we have to worry about other technical issues there. So it's just better to have the counting be done by a separate system, which is what people are basically coming up with these days. I mean, the new systems are like this, so this is not anything radical.
Okay, so this technology you're describing is already on the market.
Yes, it is. And what we need to do then is we have these scanners that are tabulating all of the paper ballots, both the ones that are marked manually by the voters and the ones that are produced by these ballot marking devices. But as I said earlier, these scanners are themselves computers. And as we know, computers can be hacked, or they can just have ordinary software bugs. And we've seen examples of that in past elections. Or they could be misprogrammed for the particular election. We have to tell, for each new election, we have to tell these scanners who the candidates are and where they're located on the ballot. And this programming there can be mistakes in this. And there's an example where the candidates' names were rotated on the ballot, but the scanner wasn't given that information. And so candidate A got the count for candidate B got the count for candidate C, and so on. And this error was rectified because they were paper ballots that could be manually checked. So this kind of totally innocent mistake can happen. So we have to be prepared both for innocent mistakes and for malevolent ones for efforts to rig elections. We need to be able to check these scanners, and we can do it. And if I can just add one more point, a lot of people say that if a voting machine, that includes a scanner or a ballot marking device or an old-fashioned touchscreen voting machine, is not connected to the internet, it cannot be hacked. It cannot be attacked remotely. And that's just not true. And the reason that's not true is that the voting machines and the scanners all have to be programmed, as I said, with the candidate names and locations. And this programming is done on another computer. And this computer typically is attached to the internet at some point, and it can be hacked. I don't know if you remember, but some years back, the Iranian centrifuges were brought down by a virus called the Stuxnet. They were caused. Iran had the centrifuges started spinning out of control so that they self-destructed. And the reason that this happened is that this virus attacked the computers that were maintaining the centrifuges. So the centrifuges themselves were not connected to the internet, but the virus attacked the computers that were connected to the internet. And that's how they brought them down. There's also a New York Times video that was made a couple months ago that shows Professor Alex Haldeman from the University of Michigan, who's also Verified Voting's first technology fellow, shows him remotely hacking into the Diebold paperless touchscreen voting machines that will be used in Georgia in the upcoming midterm and are used in some other places as well. If Alex Haldeman can remotely hack into these machines, so can a nation state. So these machines are just totally insecure, and you cannot recount them. There's no paper ballots.
And they are in approximately how many states across the country?
I don't recall how many states across the country use Diebold paperless machines. As I say, I know all of Georgia uses them. There are 5 states that are still totally paperless. That's New Jersey, Georgia, Delaware, South Carolina, and Louisiana. So those 5 states are totally paperless. No way of doing a recount in any of those states. And then there's another 8 states that are partially paperless. As I said, Pennsylvania is one of them. And so you cannot do a statewide recount in those states either.
What are the 8 states that are like the next tier of awful?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that question. I don't have it memorized, but you can find out. Anybody who's interested can go to the verifier, which is on Verified Voting's website. So it's www.verifiedvoting.org, verified voting's all one word, /verifier/. And that will bring up a map of the United States, which I'm currently looking at. And then there's color coded for each state, and you can find out what kinds of machines are used in each of the states. And if you click on a particular state, you can drill down to the county level and find out what kinds of machines are used there.
So in terms of the solution, the steps that these states need to take across the board to secure their systems, is there anything that can be done right now in time for the 2018 midterm election, especially given the widespread reporting that Russia is deliberately hacking our election to help Republicans? Even the CIA director, Mike Pompeo, said earlier this year, the Russians are going to be back. They're hacking our election. So is there anything that could be done right now, given this huge alarm that's going off? It's a matter of knowing without a doubt and not having that chaos, that confusion, the widespread doubt that shot up with the surprise election of Donald Trump. And so is there anything we can do now?
Well, it's difficult now because we're so close to the midterms. One of the points I want to make is that this is really not a partisan issue. There are Republicans, like Senator Langford of, I believe he's Oklahoma, very conservative Republican who is very concerned about these issues and very much with us. And there are other Republicans as well. So it's not a Republican Democratic issue so much as just, trying to get the right thing done. And furthermore, it's not just Russia that's a threat. I mean, we could be hacked by North Korea, by Iran, by China. I mean, a lot of our election systems are fairly wide open, and these states, these nations all have the resources to hack us, and that's what a lot of people understand, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why there's definitely Republican support to fix our elections. They understand that they could be the victims the next time. So I think it's really important that we make very clear that this is not a partisan issue. This is not Democrats versus Republicans. This is an issue about the security of our country. It's a national security issue. It's protecting our democracy. And basically anybody who's a patriot should care about making our elections secure. And fortunately, a lot of people do. So this does cross party lines. And that's a good thing, because that's the only way we're going to succeed. We need to have support from both sides of the aisle. In terms of what can be done before the upcoming midterm, it's almost impossible to make any kind of major changes for the voting machines. There is a lawsuit in Georgia right now, which has the goal, of replacing, of forcing the state to vote on paper ballots as opposed to these phenomenally insecure paperless debolt machines. It's close to the election. I think the judge has some concerns about ordering a major change like that before the election, but we don't yet know the outcome of that lawsuit, so that could conceivably make a change in Georgia. I think elsewhere there's really nothing much that can be done. But what's more important is that people have to focus on the 2020 presidential election, and there's still time to do a lot for that. And that's what I think should be the main focus of people right now. We have to make our elections secure by 2020. So, as I said, we need to have voter marked paper ballots throughout the country, which will be a big challenge just doing that by 2020. But on top of that, we need to check the scanners. As I've said, they are computers, they can be hacked. And we know how to check them. We know what needs to be done. What we need are manual post-election ballot audits, where we basically do statistically, we use statistics and we randomly select some ballots and we compare them against what the scanner says as a way of checking on the scanner. And if things all look okay, fine, we're done. If they don't look okay, we look at more ballots and we do more comparisons and basically continue that until we have convinced ourselves that the race was properly called, or there's a total manual recount and we find out who the correct winners are. This is something we know how to do. It's something that verified voting is really pushing very hard on, and some states are picking up on it. So that's what we need to do, because just having the scanners in and of themselves isn't sufficient if nobody checks them.
And what can the average citizen, what can we all do listening to you and get everything in line and wherever we live, and help other districts if our district is safe? What can the average citizen do to protect our elections in time for the next presidential election in 2020 when, this could all happen again. We could just be reliving 2016.
One thing, obviously, is to find out what kinds of systems are being used where you vote, and how secure or insecure they may be, and maybe get involved and encourage your local election officials to have voter marked paper ballot systems, and also encourage them to have manual post-election ballot audits. Obviously, some of these decisions are done at the state level, and local election officials may not have a lot of options, but they can, in turn, encourage people at the state level to make the right changes. So that's one thing people can do. Another is to support. I don't know if this is appropriate to say this, but support the work that Verified Voting is doing, because this is our mission, is to make our elections secure. That's all we do.
And we're happy to support you. You're a nonpartisan advocacy group. And as you point out, and as we've seen ourselves, talking to Republicans around these sovereignty issues and election security matters, that this is a uniting issue.
Yes.
And it seems like this is something, I just want to say from my own personal background, my mother was this hippie art school teacher, grad school dropout, who, took it upon herself to become a child safety advocate because she survived a horrendous car accident and seatbelt saved her life. And the child car seat saved my sister's life. And so my mother took it upon herself to learn how legislation works in Sacramento, California. She lived in that area, and she passed as a volunteer the child car seat law. Then she followed it with the seatbelt law. I forget which came first, but the point is that she championed these two major laws in California just as a activist. And so what can people do in terms of, so I'm a big believer that learn everything you can about an issue, learn how the process works, learn how to navigate it, get in coalition with like-minded groups and experts and fight. And eventually you can win. You can make a difference in your state. So could people really introduce laws in the state level? Could they introduce laws and they're just to make sure that their own backyard is clean?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, that would be great. I suppose one of the ways that I haven't really discussed this within Verified Voting, but we have worked on model laws in the past, so that might be something where we could be helpful. We also have what we're calling an audit roadshow, where we are going around, especially where election officials are meeting, and demonstrating to them how these what we're calling risk limiting audits, which are these statistically based audits, work, and basically how easy they are to run. So if election officials are interested in this, or if people speak to their election officials and their election officials are curious, well, perhaps they could get in touch with us and we could provide them with some information. I think that these audits, if they have paper ballots, then I think election officials can decide to do audits on their own, at least in many places. So that's something which they could push, and we can help.
I mean, it would be great to go to Verified Voting, your website, and download a kit on how I can implement these changes and start organizing in my community, in my state, what steps I should take, how a script to call the Secretary of State, what should I be saying to my Secretary of State. And I think people, that's what we saw with groups like Indivisible, where they created a packet saying this is how your government works. And then suddenly you had citizens showing up to offices in Congress and the state level and really putting pressure on the powers that be. So I feel like the more of information, simplified as much as possible for people like us, that you can put as much power as you can put in people's hands, that I think you could potentially be planting seeds of a major sea change.
Well, that's an interesting idea. We don't have that sort of thing at the moment, but of course we have the verifier, which will allow people to find out what's being used where they vote, and also has information. The same website has information about the different types of voting machines, and so there's a lot of information that can be gotten that way. In terms of these post-election ballot audits, risk-limiting audits are statistically based. They're slightly complicated to explain initially. I mean, when you get right down to the details, which is why we have this task force that's working with election officials. There have been efforts to produce relatively simple versions of how to do this. I'm not quite sure what the status of that is at the moment, I guess what I should say is if somebody has a question, they could ping me, or maybe they could ping you and you could let me know.
Yeah. Call Gaslit Nation and we will talk about this. We're happy to. I think this is the issue that brought Sarah and I together. And, I think this is something that we want to stay on and really sort of almost our beat, it's to put as much information in people's hands that they can act on.
Right. Well, I think, as I say, I think the starting point is the verifier. Just find out what kinds of machines you have. And if you don't have paper ballots, number one is you need to get paper ballots. And you need to get voter marked paper ballots. So just make sure that that there's options for voter marking the ballots. So that's number one. And then once you've got those, then you've got to make sure that there's some way of using the ballots to check on the counting. So that's the bottom line. I guess one other point. I mean, we basically have a 3-stage plan for making our election secure. Voter marked paper ballots, strong chain of custody, and that's something we should talk about also. And then these post-election statistically based ballot audits. And the strong chain of custody is that even if you've got paper ballots, you have to make sure that nobody messes with them.
What are the risks there? What do you mean by people messing with them? Like which people and how?
Well, I mean, we know in past elections before computers were involved at all, there were cases, of ballot box stuffing, of ballot boxes getting lost. I mean, there's a whole history of election rigging in our country. And where there were just paper ballots. So you have to be careful to make sure that the paper ballots are properly maintained and that there's a good chain of custody. I mean, there are ways of doing this. Like you can have everything, have video, videotape a lot of stuff. You can make sure that you have that the ballots are being stored properly under lock and key, and that the right people have access to them or don't have access to them. I mean, there are things that can be done to make sure that the ballots are secure. I'm just saying people shouldn't ignore that part of it. That's all. I mean, it's old fashioned. I mean, this is not a new thing, making the ballots secure. This is, this issue's been around for a while. But of course, in the old days, it wasn't possible to have a camera focusing on things all the time, which we could do now.
One other thing I was curious about is you've been focused on this issue for a very long time, like from what I was reading, at least back to 2002 in terms of electronic machines. And you've, dealt with this with a number of administrations. Do you feel that the Trump administration is notably different than prior ones in terms of their ability or willingness to tackle this issue?
No, I don't. I mean, when Obama was president, I tried to get that administration to take it more seriously, and they didn't.
Why were they reluctant to do so?
I think people are reluctant to think that there could be a problem. I mean, I think there was a lot of reluctance. I've actually had people come up to me. This has happened more than twice, actually, and say. And one person came up and apologized and said, "I'm really sorry. I thought you were crazy, and now I see that you were right." And then someone else came up to me and said, "I want to shake your hand. We should have listened to you." There was a lot of pushback.
Yeah, we know that feeling. Right, Andrea?
Sarah and I are making faces at each other, like nodding our heads.
That was our last 2 years, so we definitely know what you're saying there. And
yeah, I mean,
no one thinks it could happen here until it starts happening here.
And that's part of the problem, is because then they don't actually tackle the issue. And I mean, I'm just sort of curious because, Andrea and I have raised this issue of election security for a very long time. And of course,
not as long as you.
But, we've been very adamantly insisting since the last election that, this needs to be at the forefront of, everything going forward, that we can't wait till 2018. We need to tackle this immediately. And a criticism we've often received is that by even raising this issue, we are eroding social and political trust. We're attacking the integrity of the election system. And our philosophy is always, you can't solve a problem until you're willing to admit that problem exists. I was just curious if that's the kind of blowback that you've received as well, where it's sort of perceived as antagonistic, whereas actually you're meaning to be helpful and informative.
For over a decade, yes. And not only that, I'm not convinced that it's correct. Verified Voting sponsored a small study involving focus groups a few months ago. Unfortunately, we didn't ask that question, namely, if you knew that the voting system was insecure, would you go or could be insecure, would you go and vote anyway? We didn't ask that question, but the person who ran the study said her impression from the answers that she did get to other questions was that would not keep people from voting. So, this claim that by raising the issue, we will suppress voter turnout, which is something that I've heard, especially from Democrats, I might add. First of all, nobody's done a study. And the small study that we did suggests the opposite is true. And it's something, by the way, we would like to follow up on. We would like to know what the answer really is. I mean, even if it does suppress turnout, I think you still can't ignore it. But if it doesn't suppress turnout, then there's no justification for ignoring it.
I think there's just too many issues already that are that contribute to low voter turnout. Just general distrust of politicians, corruption, people not getting their needs met. And so I think this is actually a really exciting issue because it's modern, it's technology, and it's securing our country against our enemies, our very determined enemies. So I think this is something that we've seen in our own people that we engage with on Twitter. We see a massive interest in this to the point where people get really emotional discussing it. So if you could talk to us about that in terms of where do you stand on whether the election results were hacked or not, whether the results themselves, whether some Russian hacker somewhere or some North Korean hacker somewhere got lucky and called to his superior and said, hey, I managed to get in this one county in the middle of nowhere in this random state. What are your thoughts there on the results themselves being hacked, which is a very controversial issue that some people just really lose their minds over?
I'd actually rather not focus on that, primarily because if one says that the Russians hacked the election in 2016, then that's a way of turning off a lot of Republicans who say, well, then you're saying that Trump wasn't legitimately elected. And at this point, I think we need to move forward and focus on the future. We need to focus especially on the 2020 election. So what we do know is that a couple of the voter registration databases were broken into. We do know that Russia was poking around a number of the databases and, for all we know, the voting machine systems. And when probing like that happens, even if they didn't break in, and again, we don't know if they did or not in many cases, but even if they didn't, they could be setting themselves up to do it in the future. So we actually don't know what happened for sure in 2016 because there was no proper forensic analysis done after the election. And of course, in some cases, you couldn't do a forensic analysis because they were paperless systems. So we don't know what happened. I'd rather not focus on that. I'd rather focus on the fact that we know that even members of the Trump administration are saying that our country is under attack. And so we have to move forward and put in the necessary protections so that our elections are secure in the future. I think that's what we need to put all our energy into. And the last thing I want to do is to lose any potential allies by making accusations where, I just don't have any proof one way or the other. I mean, that's one of the problems with these elections is, if you can't prove that the results are correct or incorrect, that's a really bad setup. I mean, that's basically faith-based voting. And it's time to not have any more faith-based voting in this country. We have to have elections that are evidence-based, where we can prove beyond any doubt to the losers and the loser supporters that they truly lost. And in order to do that, we need paper ballots, and we need to check the machines that count those paper ballots. And we can do this. We know how to do this. This is not rocket science. There's no excuse for not doing it. And that's what we need to focus on. 2016 happened. It's over with. We need to move forward and focus on 2020. And I'm just sorry that we didn't take stronger actions earlier so that we could do more for the midterm. But, it's pretty late now. We don't want to repeat of that in 2020. We don't want to find ourselves a few months before the presidential election say it's too late now. We don't want that.
So now is the time to get organized and campaign for election security.
Absolutely. And there's hardly any state that's perfect, by the way. So there's work that can be done in almost every state. I mean, Colorado did recently institute statewide risk limiting audits, which is the kind of statistical audits that I'm talking about. Rhode Island has passed legislation to do that. Virginia, we just did a set of pilot studies in Fairfax County, Virginia, where we brought in a number of Virginia election officials, and they were amazed at how easy it was, and they really liked it. So we're hoping that we'll be able to move forward in Virginia, where they now have paper ballots, by the way, and that they didn't have all paper ballots until 2017. And that was in part because of work that Verified Voting did, where we worked directly with the chief election official to help them with the security investigations they did of those machines. So, we are making progress. It's just not fast enough. And the 2020 election is looming, and now is the time we have to focus on 2020. I mean, what we can do for 2018, people should do, but it's too late to make major changes before the midterm. It's just too late, but it's not too late for 2020.
So what should we do now, just in terms of 2018? People are going to be on edge, I think, given how loaded this issue is. Is there anything they could do if they suspect anything, if they put in a vote and another name popped up on the screen? What do you advise individual voters do to be on guard when they go to the polls in 2018? And if they do suspect or sense anything, or if any problem should come up, what should they then do?
Well, that's one of the maddening things, the example you just gave, where you vote for candidate A and candidate B's name lights up. So the question is, who did you vote for? And the answer is, who knows? I mean, it could be that your vote actually was cast for candidate A, or maybe it was cast for candidate B. The problem is that these machines go they need to be constantly tuned. And if they're not, they can just go, not behave properly. It's a terrible design. These touchscreen machines are a terrible, terrible design. They never should have been brought to market. They're really bad engineering. And in terms of what happens if you touch the screen for A and B shows up, I think one thing you can do is tell local election officials that these machines need to be fixed. They're not behaving properly. But aside from that, if these are paperless machines, there's not a damn thing you can do. The only other thing I would suggest is not vote on these machines to begin with and try to, vote absentee and cast paper ballots. But that might protect your vote, but your vote in some sense doesn't count. What counts is everybody's vote.
We want to be part of this change. It's election security. It's at its heart an extremely urgent issue. It's a patriotic matter that unites us all. So we will keep you around if you don't mind, and we can monitor this and give people some actionable insights. I don't want to let you go because I really don't. I'm getting fingers pointed at me and things to wrap it up, but I'm not. I have the mic, so I'm going to keep talking and asking questions. What's going on with Georgia? There was confusion there over, obviously it's one of the top 5 worst states in terms of election security. But there was, you have Kemp now, who's running for governor, who's Secretary of State, who was accused of doing some shady things. There's speculation there that there was some hacking that could have tipped the election. Are you familiar with this issue at all? Could you clarify, in your expert opinion, what you think happened there?
There's a whole huge history with Georgia that I won't bore you with. Basically, just to give you a high-level description, the elections in Georgia may have been the first state. I think Georgia may have been the first state to have everybody vote on these Diebold paperless touchscreen machines. That was in 2002, and that was the election where Senator Max Cleland and Governor Roy Barnes both lost, although they were slightly ahead in the polls. These were 2 Democratic candidates, incumbents who were running for re-election. We know that in that race, there were last-minute changes made to the software of these voting machines. We also know that has not been independent. Those changes were never independently vetted, and now it's impossible to see what they were. Now, in any major computing project, people are making last-minute changes because they're always finding bugs. So these changes could have been completely legitimate, or they could have been aimed at rigging the election, or they could have been a mix of both. And the problem is we don't know, and we'll never know. We'll never be able to go back and find out, were these results correct or were they not? Because there was no way then to do a recount, and there's no way now to go back and do any kinds of forensic analysis. That the software that was used then, I'm sure, is long gone. So that was 2002 in Georgia, and it's been sort of downhill ever since. The elections in Georgia were run for many, many years by a small school called Kennesaw State University, which was given the responsibility of maintaining and setting up these machines. And basically what happened was I guess it was last year, 2 years ago, someone named Logan Lamb, who's a security expert, was poking around. He lives in Georgia, and he discovered there were that he could basically get into the system at Kennesaw State University. And when he told them about it, they didn't do anything. And then months later, he came back and told them about it again. And finally, something was done. There was a whole big scandal about how insecure the Kennesaw State system was, and obviously insecure for years and years. And there's no way to know if any of the elections that were held in Georgia during that period were totally legitimate or not, because there's no way to go back and check, just like with the 2002 race. So basically what happened was eventually the responsibility for running the election was taken out of the hands of Kennesaw State University. Their contract was not renewed, and it was put into the office of the Georgia Secretary of State. Now, the Georgia Secretary of State is Brian Kemp, and Brian Kemp is running for governor. Brian Kemp has been opposed to efforts to get rid of these paperless machines and replace them with paper ballots. So he's running for governor against Stacey Abrams, who's the Democratic candidate. And unless this lawsuit that is pending in the courts forces Georgia to vote on paper ballots, that election, the midterm, is going to be held on these Diebold machines, which are being run by the Secretary of State's office.
Wow, that's a nightmare scenario. Let's hope justice prevails there. And what's also, throws up a red flag about this whole situation in Georgia is that Kislyak, the Russian ambassador who was kicked out as part of Obama's response to the Russian hacking of the U.S. election, and he met, of course, with a number of representatives of Trump's campaign. He also met with officials at Kennesaw State University, which runs Georgia's election system. He met with them in April 2016. So that doesn't give people peace of mind. So that's why you have to have these transparent, verifiable voting systems in place. So all these other little things that come up, you're not as worried about them anymore. And if you have nothing to hide, then why can't we all just switch to verified voting?
Right. And the point is that we know how to make our voting system resilient to attack. In other words, we can't prevent attacks, but we can recover from them. And we can recover from them if we have paper ballots and if we check the computers that count those paper ballots. And we can be sure that the results are correct. That's the key point. Security is really, really hard. So rather than trying to make a system totally secure, what we need to do is to make it so that it can withstand attack. And we know how to do that. And that's the problem.
Thank you so much for your leadership on this issue. Thank you for persevering. We apologize on behalf of America for all of us not listening to you sooner and giving you all the resources you need. And thank you so much. This has been a tremendous honor to speak with you today.
Gaslit Nation is presented by Dame Magazine on the Critical Frequency Podcast Network. Other podcasts on the Critical Frequency Network include Range, Fury, and Tell Me About Your Mother. Check them out. This episode was produced by Andrea Chalupa with additional support from Critical Frequency. Our theme music is by David Whited. Additional music is by Martin Wissenberg. Our cover art was drawn by Lucas Lisakowski. Illustrations for each episode are drawn by James Guthman. You can follow us on Twitter @Gaslit Nation. And if you'd like to support the podcast and see it go weekly, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/gaslit. Thanks for listening. See you next time.